Welcome to episode 144 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the ancient Epicurean texts and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. This week we'll complete our discussion of the Inscription of Diogenes of Oinoanda. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
There are many who pursue philosophy for the sake of wealth and fame, with the aim of procuring these either from private individuals or from kings, by whom philosophy is deemed to be some great and precious possession. Well, it is not in order to gain any of the above-mentioned objectives that we have embarked upon the same undertaking, but so that we may enjoy happiness through attainment of the goal craved by nature. The identity of this goal, and how neither wealth can furnish it, nor political fame, nor royal office, nor a life of luxury and sumptuous banquets, nor pleasures of choice love affairs, nor anything else, while philosophy alone can secure it, we shall now explain after setting the whole question before you. For we have had this writing inscribed in public, not for ourselves, but for you citizens, so that we might render it available to all of you in an easily accessible form without oral instruction. And we contrived this in order that even while sitting at home, we might be able to exhibit the goods of philosophy, not to all people here indeed, but to those of them who are civil spoken. And not least, we did this for those who are called foreigners, though they are not really so. For while the various segments of the earth give different people a different country, the whole compass of this world gives all people a single country, the entire earth, and a single home, the world. I am not pressurizing any of you into testifying thoughtlessly and unreflectively in favor of those who say this is true, for I have not laid down the law on anything, not even on matters concerning the gods, unless together with reason. I shall discuss folly shortly, the virtues and pleasure now. If, gentlemen, the point at issue between these people and us involved inquiry into what is the means of happiness, and they wanted to say the virtues, which would actually be true, it would be unnecessary to take any other step than to agree with them about this, without more ado. But since, as I say, the issue is not what is the means of happiness, but what is happiness and what is the ultimate goal for our nature, I say both now and always, shouting out loudly to all Greeks and non-Greeks, that pleasure is the end of the best mode of life, while the virtues, which are inopportunely messed about by these people, being transferred from the place of the means to that of the end, are in no way an end, but the means to the end. Let us therefore now state that this is true, making it our starting point. Suppose then someone were to ask someone, though it is a naive question, who is it whom these virtues benefit? Obviously the answer will be man. The virtues certainly do not make provision for these birds flying past, enabling them to fly well, or for each of the other animals, they do not desert the nature with which they live and by which they have been engendered. Rather, it is for the sake of this nature that the virtues do everything and exist.
Thank you, Martin, for reading that for us today. We're close to wrapping up the fragments of Diogenes of Oinoanda that we've selected as being some of the most important to talk about. They break down this week into a couple of different points. Martin has just read for us fragment 29, which talks about the purpose of pursuing philosophy. He's read fragment 30, which makes a very important point about how the message of Epicurean philosophy applies to everybody, no matter where they are. And then fragment 32, which talks about the relationship between virtue and pleasure. Before we go any further, let's go back into the beginning, which is fragment 29. And the emphasis there is the purpose of pursuing philosophy, because Diogenes points out that many pursue philosophy for the sake of wealth and fame. But Diogenes emphasizes that it's not the Epicurean purpose to pursue those objectives. The objective of pursuing philosophy in the Epicurean scheme of things is, quote, so that we may enjoy happiness through the attainment of the goal craved by nature. And this fragment 29 says that the identity of this goal and how neither wealth nor political fame nor royal office nor luxury nor basically sex nor anything else can procure it, while philosophy alone can secure it. And that we are having this inscription placed in public, not for ourselves alone, but to make it easily available for everybody. Martin, what's your experience been in how the pursuit of Epicurean philosophy has enhanced your happiness, if at all?
Yeah, so of course, so knowledge and applying the hedonic calculus. And I've done that before I got consciously aware of Epicurean philosophy. So that means this is something, it's not something before and after, it's just I grew by myself into it.
The whole idea of pursuing philosophy may seem strange to certain people because they think it's so impractical and detached from reality, and that you must have to have some special interest in it, like stamp collecting or something like that, in order to want to pursue it. But the Epicurean perspective is different, that it's not an end in itself, although it is pleasurable to study philosophy, is a point that Epicurus makes in the letter to Menocius. It's not an end in itself, but pleasure comes during the pursuit of philosophy. But it is, in fact, the identification of the pleasurable life through philosophy that is the important insight of the whole thing. If you don't know what your goal is, I think last week there was a phrase we read from Diogenes of Oinoanda who said something to the effect that who will seek what he can never find. In other words, you've got to decide what it is you're seeking in order to make any progress towards achieving it. And Epicurean philosophy has identified the reasons why we should conclude that there are no supernatural gods telling us what to do, that there's no absolute rules floating in the air telling us what to do, and that the real key to deciding what decisions to make and what things to choose and what things to avoid are basically the feelings of pleasure and pain, that ultimately those feelings are the bottom line of everything that we do in life. It's for those resulting feelings that we do the things we do and avoid the things that we avoid. Calasini, what do you think about the pursuit of philosophy as a tool for happiness?
Well, it seems like it's going to depend on how you define philosophy and how you think of philosophy. And perhaps now in our time, the idea of philosophy is considered rather academic and intellectual, whereas back in the time of Epicurus, there was a much different idea of philosophy, so that it was considered something very important to life and something that many people considered and studied. Whereas now you only have people going off to university who seem to study philosophy or even admit that they are studying philosophy.
That's really a regression instead of an advancement for the current age, seems to me, because now really the big issue is what's in this third paragraph of this fragment 29, that wealth and politics and office and luxury and sex and romance and those things, that's what everybody in most cases pursues nowadays because they think that that's the road to a happy life. But what they need to understand from the Epicurean perspective is that it's philosophy alone that can tell you how to pursue and what amount of those things that we just listed you should pursue without getting burned by them and still enjoy the pleasures that can come from some of them to some extent, but without letting them get out of control and cause you more pain than pleasure in the end. That you just can't pursue these things without a wider philosophical framework of how to approach them. Going forward briefly into fragment 30, one of the things that's interested me about that one is that he acknowledges in placing this inscription in the public square that not necessarily everybody is going to profit from it. He says that we've contrived this not to all people here indeed, but to those of them who are civil spoken. So it's kind of interesting in 30, we have the usual multiple meanings of things in that he's acknowledging that Epicurean philosophy is not something that's a possession of a particular people. It's not just uniquely Greek, that only Greek people can understand it or can profit from it. But he's talking about that basically the entire world can profit from it, and to the extent that they can receive it, they should. But he always acknowledges that not to all people, but to those of them who are civil spoken. And there's a phrase like that in Diogenes Laertius as well, where the translation there is well constituted, that not everybody is able to philosophize. And while that probably applies to too young or just having some kind of a mental disability, it is interesting that he doesn't necessarily expect everybody to be able to understand or profit, which has an application, I think, in terms of what we can expect as well. For those of us who think Epicurean philosophy is a very desirable way of thinking, it's not going to be a good idea to expect that just because we think it's desirable and attractive and makes the most sense that everybody is going to agree with it. And if this translation is correct in the words that he chose, he says, those of them who are civil spoken. Martin, you got any comment on what is going on in his mind when he talks about those of them who are civil spoken?
Yeah, that word isn't clear enough.
Yeah. This past week, there was a comment I think Don made on the forum about evangelization and so forth and pamphleteering. It's interesting that I think Cicero in one of his speeches said something about one of the Epicureans having pamphlets for the occasion or something that indicated that they did circulate written material. But the bottom line being that not everybody wants to talk about philosophy. Not everybody's interested in philosophy, especially when you start talking about the religious aspects of things. There's going to be much resistance to ideas that are controversial, like those in Epicurean philosophy. Okay, and then turning to fragment number 32, which is one of the ones that I think is extremely interesting for people today who read about Epicurus in the context of Stoicism and this issue of the relationship between virtue and pleasure. And of course, this is being written in around 100 AD. The Stoics and the Epicureans have been sparring back and forth for several hundred years by this point. And this issue has remained about what is the relationship between virtue and pleasure, which, of course, is covered in Principal Doctrine number 5, that the two go hand in hand, which is basically the Epicurean position that they go hand in hand. And in fact, the reason for pursuing virtue is pleasure. But there's always this back and forth about whether virtue is an end in itself. The cliche being virtue is its own reward. And so the way Diogenes of Oinoanda answers that question is this section of fragment 32, which I think is well worth repeating. If, gentlemen, the pointed issue between these people and us, and in that case, these people almost certainly would be the Stoics, involved inquiry into what is the means of happiness, and they wanted to say the virtues, which would actually be true, it would be unnecessary to take any other step than to agree with them about this without more ado. So again, he's laying the foundation that the means to happiness is virtue, even under the Epicurean worldview. Then he goes on, but since, as I say, the issue is not what is the means of happiness, but what is happiness and what is the ultimate goal of our nature, I say both now and always, shouting out loudly to all Greeks and non-Greeks, that pleasure is the end of the best mode of life, while the virtues, which are inopportunely messed about by these people, being transferred from the place of the means to that of the end, are in no way an end, but the means to the end. Let us now therefore state that this is true, making it our starting point. And maybe it sounds like it's verbal sparring and that it's not that important, but I think both the Epicureans and the Stoics of the ancient world saw this to be extremely important, identifying what is in the end, logically, the goal. If you say the goal, that implies one goal, that there is one thing that is the ultimate end and the ultimate reason that you do everything else, which is stated in that way in the Torquata section as well. And if you have to come up with one thing that is the ultimate goal, it is very important from the Epicurean point of view to identify that it is pleasure and not virtue itself, because you pursue pleasure for the sake of pleasure. Pleasure is a feeling that gives you a reward, an emotional response that is irreducible. There's nothing behind pleasure to us as a reason for pleasure other than the feeling itself. But virtue is not in that same category, because there is no God, there is no absolute rule that says that virtue must be pursued. So you have to ask the question, well, why are you being virtuous? Why are you pursuing virtue? And despite all of the attempts to answer that question that you'll see people give from the Stoic Platonic perspective, in the end, it has always made sense to me, and it seems to be the Epicurean argument, that if you're not getting a reward, that if there's not a reason to pursue virtue, you're left with an empty goal that has no benefit in and of itself. It's only pleasure itself as a physical or mental feeling that is of its own worth pursuing.
Thinking about this, it seems that it creates two different paths for how one makes choices and avoidances. Because if virtue is the end goal, like aiming for perfection in everything you do, and not for any kind of feeling of pleasure, if you're going for kind of an abstract ideal, somehow thinking that that will result in happiness, you're going to make different choices. For example, how you organize your environment, you're going to get really strict with yourself and create order because somehow, like there's the cliche, cleanliness is next to godliness. So there's this idea of the perfection of things. And so your choices are going to be going toward that ideal state. Even if it doesn't bring you happiness, you're kind of going for a conceptual understanding. You're occupying yourself with some kind of behavior that's almost ritualized in some attempt to somehow find happiness from that. But then now we have with Epicureanism, choices and avoidances, understanding that virtue is just a tool that aids toward the final end of pleasure. So you don't go all out with your virtue for the sake of a perfection, an idealized way of doing things. You realize that you're choosing according to what brings pleasure. So life is much more easy and not so strict and hard. It's more going with the flow and seeing what really works for the best pleasure and happiness.
That's very well stated. What you brought up in my mind is almost the issue of people can be obsessive and compulsive about all sorts of things. They pick up some habit or some standard practice and they ritualize it, as a word you used, which was an excellent word, into an end in itself, and eventually forget that there's any other goal to be pursued. In saying that, there's the analogy in the Epicurean material about Polyaenus, I believe, is the name of the geometrician, and there was controversy about the fact that before he became fully an Epicurean, he was just a master geometrician and he was pursuing geometry. But after he became an Epicurean, supposedly, according to the critics, he gave up geometry just to pursue pleasure. The response to that, and this is an argument that's in Francis Wright's A Few Days in Athens, is that the reason you pursue geometry is to pursue pleasure. If you find pleasure in geometry, in pursuing it, you're going to continue to pursue it just as you would before. You're just not going to get confused that geometry in itself is the goal of your life. And that kind of confusion is what I think leads people to just get consumed with, again, obsessive compulsive behavior, losing sight about what the ultimate goal is in the first place. I believe this past week, Calcina, you posted a thread about people who are confronting suicidal thoughts and so forth. And there's a section in Lucretius where he talks about how ironic it is that it's often people who fear death or fear the gods unjustly who get led by this fear of death into such a despair that they end up committing suicide. And with the irony being that it was the fear of death in the first place that led them to this sort of spiral of despair. So it's certainly one of the key aspects of Epicurean philosophy that is so important to identify clearly in your mind that the goal of living is to live happily, and everything else you do, every decision you make, everything that you engage in is subordinate to that goal. If it enhances your happiness, then you do it. If it detracts from your happiness, then you don't do it. And you don't let any kind of activity in life where you get so obsessed with perfection and being the best in your field at a particular thing can be very admirable. But I think we all have seen examples of how that kind of a thinking can take over a person's life and just become all consuming, to the point of leading you to make terrible decisions in other aspects of your life that really undermine your ultimate total happiness.
I agree with your explanations now. The only thing is we may need to add for Polyaenus that might be that he abandoned geometry might have been an invention of Frances Wright in her novel. So that means this is not something what we can state as a historic fact.
Right. The material that Frances Wright wrote always has to be looked at from that point of view. We could put this in the show notes and see what we can find this coming week. I think there are other references to that, but I'm not sure whether it's in Cicero or Diogenes Laertius or somewhere else, as far as whether he abandoned it or just reduced it or whatever. So
Cicero has a remark on this one, but it doesn't really indicate that Polyaenus abandoned it. So I don't think we can take Cicero's account there as claiming that.
Something to the effect, I think Cicero said that if Epicurus had listened to Polyaenus' geometry, he'd have been better off, something like that, if I remember. Are you looking at the quote?
Yes, Sam. I mean, I don't have it at hand, but something to that end. Of course, this one would be compatible with Polyaenus abandoning geometry or mathematics or whatever it was, but it doesn't claim it. No?
Right. And of course, that sounds similar to the criticism that Epicurus should have followed Democritus more directly than he did when he came up with the swerve, which was not within the Democritan view of things. So there's that criticism out there of Epicurus with the implicit basis of the criticism that he should have been more obsessive in a certain way, that he should have followed Democritus more slavishly, or that he should have listened to Polyaenus instead of deducing that in the end, the goals of atomism or the goals of geometry serve the life of happiness as opposed to serving themselves. And in fact, I suppose we could include here in this fragment 32, the next sentence, which has been a little bit difficult for me to understand over the years, has been, suppose then someone to ask, though it's a naive question, who is it whom these virtues benefit? Obviously, the answer will be man. The virtues do not make provision for these birds flying past, enabling them to fly well, or for each of the other animals. They do not desert the nature with which they live and by which they have been engendered. Rather, it is for the sake of this nature that the virtues do everything and exist. The last part of it, I think, really does bring it home. Virtue doesn't exist on its own. It does not, when it says here, desert the nature with which it lives and which it has been engendered. It's for the sake of that nature that the virtues do everything and exist. So when the Epicurean philosophy identifies that the only thing that nature has given us is feeling, has given us pleasure and pain by which to make decisions, I think the point here is that virtue is one of these things, like logic, like reasoning, like any other number of tools that are out there for us to make use of, that don't exist by themselves. There is no such thing as courage floating in the air or wisdom floating in the air. Virtue and those characteristics don't desert the nature by which they live and by which they were born. It's for the sake of that nature that the virtues do everything and exist. You don't live to be virtuous. You are virtuous in order to live happily, which would imply, of course, that what is virtue becomes very difficult to define. There's not an absolute definition of it. It sounds like what Epicurus is suggesting here, that we really evaluate whether something in the end is virtuous or not in isolation, but in accord with the results that come from it.
As I was looking over the fragments, starting with 29 and 30 and a little bit further down, there's like a main fragment and then there's a lower margin fragment. And that lower margin fragment is basically a principal doctrine. So it's almost as if this is presented as commentary on each principal doctrine. But I don't know how many of the principal doctrines were covered.
Yeah, I think you're raising a very interesting point here. And there are several articles out there about the likely arrangement of the wall and whether he had all the principal doctrines listed. But, that goes back to where we started when we first tackled the inscription. It's like Diogenes obviously had a limited amount of space, a limited amount of resources to convey what he wanted to convey. So he had to decide what was the most important thing to talk about. And so it does look like the material we've been discussing so far is sort of a commentary, like you said, Calasini, a summary, his own spin on what he thought was the most important material and how it should be applied. This fragment 32 would be a great example of that. This is not anything that I think we're aware of as being a text that dates back to Epicurus, but this issue about saying that he's going to shout to all Greeks and non-Greeks that this issue is so important, that certainly sounds like commentary and emphasis by him personally about what he thinks is important, which is, again, the kind of thing that we have to think about ourselves as we discuss Epicurean philosophy is there's a tremendous number of interesting details and basically rabbit trails we could follow as we attempt to, from a sort of academic perspective, reconstruct information. But we have to make a choice as to what's important for us to talk about. And therefore, as we begin to come to the final section of the podcast, I can't think of any better way to proceed than to have Joshua join us and help us summarize the meaning of the inscription. Joshua, how are you today?
I'm here, yes.
And so now that Joshua's joined us here, as we discussed at the beginning of the episode, there's really a couple of major points that are being made here that we've talked about today, basically in fragments 29 and 30, that the purpose of philosophy is the pursuit of a pleasurable life, happy living. And as we read in 30, we're talking to people who are, quote in this text, civil spoken, but we're talking to basically everybody, that while different people live in different countries, the whole compass of the world gives all people a single country, the entire earth, and a single home, the world. And that we're not pressuring any of you into unreflectively and thoughtlessly accepting what I say, not even on matters concerning religion. But I'm presenting, it says here, unless together with reasoning. So the emphasis on the importance of identifying happy life as the purpose of philosophy, the purpose of everything we do, and that is a perspective that applies to everybody, not just to those of us who somehow have a particular background or interest in philosophy. It's really a truth that really applies to everyone, and that it's not just something that you should assert or accept on the faith, but is supported by the reasoning that Epicurus has produced.
What we get here is a unique Epicurean voice from the 2nd century, from an unusual place, again in Asia Minor, as we discussed in the first episode, but talking about the same kind of stuff as we get in all of the other Epicurean texts. It's the reason that we pursue philosophy and what we expect to get out of it. And in one of my more favorite passages, that description of reaching out to the people that are called foreigners. And he says, though they are not really so, for while the various segments of the earth give different people a different country, the whole compass of this world gives all people a single country, the entire earth, and a single home, the world. And so, again, it's every extra source that we have from the ancient world dealing with Epicureanism is such a good benefit to us, because while they all talk about the same stuff, they oftentimes do it in slightly different ways. And Diogenes of Oinoanda seems to have a unique voice, just as Lucretius has a unique voice. And you're missing out if you don't have access to all of them.
Just before you arrived, Joshua, Calasini had made the point that the inscription included perhaps both recitations of some of the doctrines, but also commentary, such as what we're reading here today. And that's really probably the take-home point of everything we're talking about here, is that Diogenes is giving us an example of summarizing the practical benefits of the philosophy and the reason why we're even discussing it in a way that just about anybody can and should understand. That if you don't identify what the goal of your life is, you're probably not going to reach that goal by chance. The most likely path to successfully achieving your goal is to identify what that goal is and not select something else in the place of it and let other things distract you from pursuing the ultimate goal.
Yeah. Coming back to Joshua's comment on fragment 30, I think it is important that we kept this here, because other text fragments from elsewhere, they may indicate something so like that not all people were considered capable even to understand it. But now this one is correcting this. So this one means in principle, it is really for everybody. It just they need to figure it out. And that might then be the difference between different people, that for some, it's by tendency more easy, and for others, there are more difficulties to overcome.
Right.
Yeah, and what we see is sort of the outside view looking in with Cicero, which is that it's working. Cicero makes the complaint that the Epicureans are just scooping up adherents from the crossroads. And he says something to the effect of, they're good people, there's nothing wrong with them, but is it really possible that they understand this philosophy while I do not? He says, while I, Cicero, do not. But Diogenes of Oinoanda seems to think that it's within the compass of everybody to get a grasp of the major points of Epicurean philosophy. And while you can spend a lifetime studying it, it's not hard to explain, and it's not hard to understand.
But apparently there's a lot of people in the world who have a difficulty understanding the material that's presented in the next section that we're discussing today, this fragment 32, about the relationship between virtue and pleasure. It seems like there's no greater grounds for people to come to blows in discussing Epicurus than this issue of the relationship between the two, which Diogenes of Oinoanda is presenting right here on his wall to everybody, including foreigners, as we were just discussing, but in a way that emphasizes when he says that he's shouting it out to all Greeks and non-Greeks, that it is pleasure that's the end of life, while the virtues are the means to the end and not the end in itself. And we discussed that a little bit before you got here, Joshua, but that's such a huge point that I definitely want to get your take on that relationship and why the Epicureans would be emphasizing that so much. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's not uniquely said here. And in fact, I think one of the good sources for this would be Frances Wright's A Few Days in Athens, where she talked quite extensively, actually, about the relationship between virtue and pleasure and what is the actual goal of philosophy. And it's clear from all Epicurean sources that the real goal, and not just of philosophy, but of life, is to pursue a life of pleasure. But you're writing in the context, or speaking in the context, or chiseling, as is the case here, in the context of a culturally Greek world where it is virtue that most people at least tell themselves that they want to strive for. And he says it maybe more clearly here than he says elsewhere. He shouts clearly to all Greeks and non-Greeks that pleasure is the end of the best mode of life. You're getting something different in Torquatus, but in fact, Torquatus goes into it and says that even those who behave as they think for the purpose of behaving virtuously, what is the goal of that? The goal is still pleasure. The goal is still happiness. So it's a struggle that never ends, this struggle between pleasure and virtue and which of them actually constitutes the end or goal of life. But Diogenes of Oinoanda is unequivocal. He knows exactly where he stands on this. And it's the same place that Epicurus stands, same place that Lucretius stands.
You know, you guys correct me if you think this analogy is not a good one, but if I were trying to explain this to people on the public square somewhere in the United States in 2022, the word virtue is not exactly on the tip of the tongue of most common people at the local shopping center. It's not a word that's even used that much in common conversation. But I think it's probably fair to substitute the idea of being, quote, a good person. Even most people on the street understand what it means to want to be a good person. And I think that Epicurus would say the very same thing. It is not being a good person that is the goal of life, but being a good person is the best way to achieve a pleasurable life. And you evaluate what it means to be a good person and the things that a good person would or would not do with that goal of happy living in mind. But that there is no divine or absolute definition of a good person that everybody must comply with. And that if you focus so much on the idea of being, quote, a good person, unquote, you can become, as Calasini was discussing earlier, you can go off in a direction of sort of habitual behavior, ritualistic behavior was the word that Calasini used, and totally lose sight of what the ultimate goal of your life is.
The other issue with virtue is that while it might be worthwhile to live virtuously so as to live pleasantly, pleasure has a much more immediate foundation or impact in nature. And as Epicurus will always do, he starts his inquiry with nature. And I don't want to fall into the trap here of modern natural law arguments on what is moral and what is not moral because it's not natural. I don't think that was really a current philosophical view in Epicurus's time. It was coming into view when Diogenes of Oinoanda was writing because, of course, Christian theology was bringing it into view. But pleasure has an immediacy that is understandable to everyone, I think. And virtue is there's a lot more to be argued about when it comes to virtue, isn't there? Because you could have two different groups who are both saying, well, my goal is to live virtuously, but they each have a different set of definitions for what constitutes living virtuously. Pleasure is something where you can't really argue about it too much because it's sort of that I know it when I see it. What Supreme Court justice was that?
Was it Oliver Wendell Douglas? Perhaps. Or somebody said that in regard to, I hate to use the word pornography in this context, but I think that's what it was about.
Yeah, or even just obscenity in general.
Obscenity, yes. That's such a huge point that people tend to gloss over it. What is the good? People act as if, of course, we know what it means to be a good person. But we really don't, because unless you're looking to some definition from the Bible or from some religion, you don't have a definition of those words. And we would say the same thing about Plato or just any kind of idealism or absolutism at all. You've got to state, just as was said in Fragment 30, you must present together with your reasoning the basis for your assertion. Epicurus presents nature and says that nature gives us the feelings of pleasure and pain by which to make decisions, and that ends up being the basis for our decision making about what to do in life, that there is no absolute good, there is no absolute evil other than what we derive through pleasure and pain. But people don't want to grapple with that ultimate realization that that's the place you have to start. What is the basis for everything that you do? And what are you going to accept as your authority? Are you going to accept nature and the feelings of pleasure and pain? Or are you going to accept some other standard of what is good and bad or good and evil? And Epicurus says those other standards do not exist, which is what comes from the atomist physics and epistemology in the first place. But again, the idea of should your ultimate goal be that of being a good person or that of being a happy person? And presenting it in that way can be very controversial, but it's clear that Epicurus is saying that the good person is a happy person, but that there is no good person who is not happy. Again, principal doctrine number 5, how these things go hand in hand. And if they don't go hand in hand, then you've got some other standard that you've arbitrarily picked rather than the feelings of pain and pleasure. Joshua, this is not something that I'd put in this way before, and I'd like to see what your comment is about it. But the sentence that comes after the shouting passage where it says that the virtues do not make provision for the birds flying past, the virtues do not desert the nature with which they live and by which they have been engendered. Rather, it is for the sake of this nature that the virtues do everything and exist. And just in reading that today, for some reason, it's striking me with greater clarity than it usually does. I think that's a pretty clear statement that virtue doesn't exist on its own. And again, if you equate the good with it, the good doesn't exist on its own. They are part and parcel of the living beings that engender them and by which they live. And they don't desert that nature, but it is for the sake of that nature, that living being, that they do everything and they exist. Would that be consistent with your take on that sentence?
I think so, yeah. And, there's a tendency made, I guess, by humans to think of themselves as being separated from nature in a way, whether you think that you're marked off as a special creation or whether you think that you've just risen above nature. But to me, any real account of our place in the universe has to also take account of the cockroach and its place in the universe. It doesn't make sense for me to talk about the meaning of life if this question of the meaning of life doesn't equally apply to non-human animals and organisms. We're part and parcel of nature. And so any question we asked about ourselves has to be a question that is grounded in nature. If you think that you're a soul riding around in a body and that when the body collapses, the soul is going to go off, live somewhere else for eternity, you're going to have a different answer to these fundamental questions than if you consider yourself and your soul to be fundamentally natural and to perish or die when the body dies. And so there's a gulf of difference between Epicurus's view on nature and death and pleasure and life and all of these most basic issues. There's a fundamental chasm that exists between those issues and most of the answers that everybody else is coming up with, because they don't want to deal with this problem that humans are, to all appearances, merely natural. I don't think that's a bad thing. Some people think that's a bad thing.
Oh, yeah, that's a great comment. And when you have that perspective, going back to the issue that sometimes comes up about what is our relationship to other people. I mean, if you have that perspective and you think that it's true, for yourself and for your friends as well, that your life is short and it's so important to properly use the time that you do have. So I can certainly identify with Diogenes of Oinoanda or Lucretius in wanting to take this information and attractively package it and present it to people who don't currently have that information so that at least it's available to them. Just as Diogenes again says here in this text, it's not like we're going to pressure people, or we should try to pressure people to accept something that they don't want to believe or that they don't believe or just are dedicated to something else. But even though we know that not everybody is going to agree with us, and that whether or not everybody's capable of it in terms of whether they're too young or have any mental conditions or something that makes it impossible for them to understand the philosophy, there's still, once you have this viewpoint, a benevolent motivation to explain to people what the possibility is of the errors that they are making, and that if they would just simply step back and look at the bigger picture and examine some very basic issues, they could profit tremendously from doing so. And that reminds me of the quote from Lucian we have on the front page of the Epicurean Friends website, where it says that the purpose of his writing that Alexander the oracle monger was to strike a blow for Epicurus, the man whose holiness and divinity of nature were not shams, who alone imparted true insight into the good, and who brought deliverance to all that consorted with them. And so those are kind of apocalyptic or religious type words to describe the situation. But nevertheless, it's this insight into the ultimate questions of what's good and bad that is sort of a necessary first step if you're going to deliver yourself or help your friends to escape the grip of errors that are plaguing their lives with unhappiness.
I think that's a very good point. And just one more thing on this issue of whether humans are part of nature or not, because it was very often the view that humans have two aspects. You've got the soul, which is supernatural, and then you've got the body, which is natural. And that the project of life is to subdue the flesh so that the spirit may soar, or however you want to put it. But if we could have brought Epicurus's message to, for example, St. Jerome, although he knew about it, he wouldn't have to beat himself bloody with a rock in order to subdue the flesh, because he would have understood that his flesh was part of him and he was part of nature. And there is no reason to do what St. Benedict did, which was throw yourself into a bramble bush. This purposely inflicting pain on yourself to draw a finer distinction between the flesh and the soul is a position you cannot arrive at reasonably if you start with Epicurus's major points.
Even heretic within Christianism. So repeatedly, the Vatican has discouraged people from doing that. I mean, like the two people Joshua just mentioned it, to injure themselves because they falsely interpreted separation between soul and body. So repeatedly, the Vatican clearly said we should not do that. So it's not only from Epicurean, also by proper application of the Christian teachings, you get to the same result.
Okay, well, as we begin to come to the end of today's episode, we're probably also at the end of this examination of the Inscription of Diogenes of Oinoanda. There's a lot more material that's in it, unfortunately, much of it in fragmentary condition. But for purposes of our podcasting, we'll bring the examination to an end today. So why don't we close the episode with any general comments that anybody wants to make about the inscription itself and how it fits into their view of Epicurean philosophy. We've made general comments already about how what Diogenes of Oinoanda has done is very similar to what Lucretius has done, and how it's consistent with an Epicurean worldview to be concerned about other people and want to express to them in general ways the important aspects of Epicurean philosophy. Any other general thoughts as we begin to close on Diogenes of Oinoanda?
It just occurred to me that simply the geographical reach of Epicureanism throughout its whole history. I was reading a review of Stephen Greenblatt's book, The Swerve, and the person who wrote the review made the slightly strange claim that Epicureanism was rare, not just rare after the Middle Ages, but even before them. And I thought that couldn't more clearly contradict the historical record. And one of the reasons we know that is because of the sheer breadth or reach of the Epicurean empire. It stretches from essentially Asia Minor, which is where we've been located for all of this inscription, to Egypt in the south, particularly centered in the city of Alexandria. And there are, I think, maybe 2 or 3 named Epicureans associated with that city. Of course, we don't have their books surviving. obviously in Greece and Rome, but even as far afield from Asia Minor as France, where you've got this famous, what they call it, the House of the Authors in France. And it has a mural or mosaic on the wall with portraits of some of the early Epicureans. And I can't immediately recall which ones are on the wall.
I'm thinking Metrodorus and Epicurus.
I think you're right about that. Auten, I actually found it.
What I remember is that I think Bernard Fischer used that to argue about which direction his arm was placed in these ancient statues of Epicurus. Autun.
There's an inscription associated with each one, and for Epicurus it says, "It is not possible to live with pleasure without living in a careful, good, and just way, nor to live in a careful, good, and just way without living with pleasure." And then Metrodorus, "We are born only once. It is not possible to be born twice. You, however, who are not master of your tomorrow, postpone the joy. But life is lost within the time limit, and each of us dies busy."
Another constant theme, how important it is not to procrastinate in attempting to pursue our goals of happy living.
So in addition to Diogenes of Oinoanda and his inscription, you've got this mosaic in the House of Authors, the House of the Greek Philosophers, in Autun, in France. Autun was actually, I think, founded by Augustus. It was Augustinodum or something like that. So you've got this Epicurean influence there. And in addition to that, we've got the works of Philodemus, which has been partially recovered from the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. So it's very, very strange how some of this stuff gets preserved. I guess we're lucky to have as much as we do. One thing I might point out is that the mosaics in this House of Authors in France was also dated from the 2nd century.
About the same time as the inscription.
About the same time as the inscription, and again, about the same time that Lucian was writing his work against Alexander the Oraclemonger and his true story where he goes into space and all of that. So clearly there's an important flourishing all across the Roman Empire. If it's in France, if it's in Asia Minor, if it's in Greece, if it's in Rome, if it's in Alexandria, this is clearly a flourishing that is occurring all over the empire at about the same time, and about the same time that Christianity is really coming into its own.
Well, and that's the point I was about to make a comment about, is that here we are several hundred years after Epicurus, no evidence that the influence of other philosophies had run the Epicurean school out of business. It's not like the blinding, brilliant insights of Stoicism had led everyone to abandon Epicurus. It's not like Neoplatonism or any kind of philosophy of idealizing logic or abstractions had swept away the Epicurean viewpoint. It was something else that eventually led to the submergence of the Epicurean viewpoint, the influence of this new religion from the East that eventually swept everything else away in its path. So the Epicurean viewpoint was not defeated by a better philosophical outlook, by the superior reasoning of Stoicism or Platonism or Aristotelianism or any other kind of Greek philosophical outlook. It was superseded only by a absolutist religious viewpoint.
After looking at these fragments and then also thinking back on the letter to Monosius, it seems that what comes up here is going to be good source material or even just an outline for how to create an Epicurean pamphlet for now, for our times. What would we need to include? And going through and seeing, for example, the wall is really just a big giant pamphlet in physical form, and using clues from that to create what we need now. It really would be good if we had pamphlets to give out. And I don't know who we would give the pamphlets to. That would just be up to each individual to decide. But if there's ever to be any in-person meetings in the future of Epicureans, instead of just online, but to have in-person meetings, it seems pamphlets would be a very good thing to have on hand.
Yeah, the whole idea of summarizing the philosophy into an attractive written presentation and making it available as opposed to forcing people to listen to you by yelling at them on the street corner. That seems to be the way that they approach things in the ancient world, and it probably makes sense today as well, to know what the really important points are, to convey them in an attractive and persuasive manner and not attempt to force people a bunch of details that they're not ready for, but to at least be able to introduce the major topics and why they're important. So I really do agree with that. Diogenes of Oinoander's public presentation on this wall is probably even more so than the Lucretius's poem, the best indication we have of a mature Epicurean presentation of its important points to a general audience. And even though what we have left is fragmentary, even in those sections that are fragmentary, we at least know the topics that are being discussed. And we do see that he was discussing physics. He was discussing epistemological issues, the nature of the universe type issues. So that those are not necessarily advanced topics for people who have spent 6 weeks reading about pleasure and happiness. They're foundational topics that should be discussed early in the process to inform all the rest of it. So I really do agree there that Diogenes' Inscription is one of the best prototypes we have left for that.
The other example of this tendency to write and deliver pamphlets of the early Epicureans, I think the best source we have on this comes from Cicero. He's in the Senate and he's delivering, I think, a speech on the floor of the Senate to his fellow senator, who is Calpurnius Piso, who is the father-in-law of Julius Caesar. And the Senate is trying to decide what to do about Caesar. And Cicero shouts out to Piso, send him a pamphlet, because both Piso and apparently Julius Caesar were inclined toward the Epicurean school. So send him a pamphlet was Cicero's satirical or sarcastic way of putting it. But it reflects a truth that existed in reality, which was they were pamphleteers. They did have a tendency to summarize their philosophy and try and get it out to as many people as possible. And the 3 letters that we've already gone through, the letters to Herodotus, Pythocles, and Menoikeus, are a perfect example of what that looked like. And Diogenes of Oinoanda, picking up on that same clue, is doing exactly the same thing about 400 years later in Asia Minor.
And that timeline provides what I think is the best way for us to wrap up the episode and these sections on Diogenes of Oinoanda. Because what we've been discussing is essentially a big stone pamphlet and a method of explaining to other people the very basic important things of Epicurean philosophy so that they can decide for themselves whether they want to adopt and apply Epicurean perspectives to their own lives. We've been doing that hopefully over the last several weeks in talking about Diogenes of Oinoanda, and our plan for a future podcast over the next several weeks is going to go also in the same direction. We're planning on starting a series of very general summaries of the important aspects of Epicurean philosophy. We're planning on using the organization plan, so to speak, of Norman DeWitt's Epicurus and His Philosophy just to help us organize the major topics into a coherent way. But over the last many episodes and even several years of this podcast, we've attempted to use the details of the surviving text as discussion material to go over these points in detail. And what we'll do beginning with our next episode is to maybe step back and take a little bit more general approach. And as Diogenes of Oinoanda has done, as Lucretius has done, we'll be thinking about and talking about the broad outlines and the basics of Epicurean philosophy. The details are sometimes important, sometimes they're not. As Epicurus himself said in the letter to Herodotus, you don't frequently need the details, but you do frequently need a general outline in your mind of the important aspects of the philosophy. We have the Vatican sayings, we have the principal doctrines, we have the letters of Epicurus, but even those to some extent requires more brain power or memory power than at least I am able to sustain from day to day. But even in those times when the details are not necessary, it's still necessary to have a basic organizational framework, a, so to speak, operating system for your computer of your brain that provides the flow from day to day of keeping these things in perspective so that you don't fall into the trap of thinking that virtue or any other particular abstraction is an end in itself. And so we'll start working with that next week. Let's go ahead and see if anyone has any final comments on Diogenes of Oinoanda, and then we'll see you again in a week. Any final comments on Diogenes of Oinoanda? Calasini?
I found it interesting to be a part of this, so thank you. I enjoyed it.
We're glad to have had you, and we'll certainly look forward to having you in the coming episodes. Martin, any closing thoughts on Diogenes of Oinoanda?
No, nothing.
All right. Thank you as always, Martin. Joshua?
I said it in the first episode, and I think it might be worth repeating that this is the longest inscription that survives from the ancient world on any subject. And as we come now to having discussed it for several weeks, it might be clear, even in fragmentary form, how long this inscription must have been and the trouble and time that it would have taken to produce it. So grateful that it was produced and that it survives, and for the work of the archaeologists who have rediscovered it in the modern age. And very interesting to have read it more closely for the podcast now.
And interesting to think that to a certain extent, what we've been doing is exactly what Diogenes of Oinoanda intended. He intended to preserve these basic points for people across the world to understand the important aspects of Epicurean philosophy. And we have just been doing our small part to get that very same message thousands of years later, and not just to Asia Minor, but across the world. So his inscription continues to this day to serve the purpose for which it was originally erected. It may be in fragments, it may be strewn across the ground in this mountainous area of Turkey, but he has succeeded in preserving the message that he intended to preserve. And I think that's a happy note to end our discussion of Diogenes of Oinoanda on today. So thank you for being here with us today. Please drop by the forum. We will put some notes up about some of the things we discussed today. And then we'll be back next week with a new episode. So until then, thanks very much, and we'll see you in a week.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.